Hello, everybody. Welcome to A Way Forward. I'm your host, Maaria. Today, I have a very special guest with me. Pushkar Sharma is the co-founder and executive director of Sacred, an Illinois-based organization working to strengthen our just and inclusive democracy. He's also the 2024 Soros Equality Fellow. Pushkar is an organizer, a strategist, a peace builder. I love that term, peace builder, who has worked with the UN in South Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Thank you for joining me. How are you, Pushkar?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today.
We have similarities. I mean, I'm a Pakistani American, and so I've heard stories of the partition. You've heard stories of the partition, and how those histories impact you and impact who you are as you develop and how you see yourself in the world. It brings me to your current role in your organization that you have co-founded. But Sacred, from my understanding, the non-for-profit that you have co-founded, and another way that you can make impact yourself as an individual, addresses issues that stem from perhaps the partition, different issues that come up between minority groups. If you just want to tell the audience a little bit about Sacred and how you got there.
Yeah, I am the descendant or child of a family that were refugees post-partition in South Asia when the British colonizing power established two separate nations. Our family was then in Lahore, Pakistan, and shifted like 10 million others. It's believed at that moment of partition, 10 million people were displaced. It's believed that 1 to 2 million people died. And the unfortunate reality of violence driven by religious exclusion that faced people on both sides of the line. And so as that kind of history hit me growing up, it started to dawn upon me that nobody should experience, displacement, violence, exclusion based on any, one of their identities.
Why don't we talk about what the partition is? If you can just say a word about what the partition is for people who don't know.
In 1947, the British colonial empire in South Asia ended. And as the British empire left, it was really in the last 6 or months or to a year where they drew up a plan to partition, so draw a line through parts of South Asia, creating at that stage 2 separate countries, India, Pakistan, which was then split into 2 sections, 2 segments, West Pakistan, East Pakistan. And the logic that was developed was it should be done via religious partition, in a sense, Pakistan being a Muslim homeland. Many scholars have analyzed and look at kind of the nefarious purposes of this. Perhaps the British were really hoping to set up South Asia for failure and just create internal enemies along new lines and new identities and harden those identities. South Asia is incredibly diverse, religiously and in every way, linguistically, ethnically, go down the list. But the concept that these areas are the only parts, for a Muslim community is frankly ridiculous. I mean, India is a country that has the 2nd largest Muslim population in the world, Muslim population of over 220 million people. Let me repeat that, 220 million people. Which is actually close to the size of Pakistan, for example. Like it's above the size of Pakistan, but close to the size of the U.S. Actually, like U.S., it's 330 million. So a minority that is almost 2/3 the size of the U.S. is an enormous minority. So, anyways, the logic of partition was always deeply questionable. But as I described before, as part of this drawing the line in the sand and creating these 2 separate entities, there were many people on both sides of the line who were not, who was meant to be living there based on the British logic. So 10 to 12 million people were displaced, or refugees, as they crossed those
They
borders.
crossed. That's a partition, and of course, we have heard stories from elders and from history and scholars about the sacrifices that were made and the trains of people that came with dead bodies when they got to where when the train actually ended up being where it needed to be. So there is a shared trauma between individuals in South Asia on both sides of this. Um, and that trauma and that post colonial experience, and I would say colonial experience, impacts generational trauma, right? And also generational sensibilities and opinions and habits, which brings me directly to your motivation to found Sacred.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point here, it's funny, you described yourself Pakistani American. I'm comfortable describing myself as Pakistani American because we are from Lahore. Lahore is in Pakistan. And
Mhm.
so, like, how do we erase that history of our family, right? And frankly, it starts to demonstrate how superficial a lot of these identities are. When did they start? India, for example, is not a term indigenous to South Asia. So to
Mhm.
call myself Indian American, it's, who created the word India. To call myself South Asian American also. South Asia is in reference to other, it's a reference to Asia as a
Right.
continent, you know. So all of these things are identities that are put on from the outside. It's all in the English language as well, right? So to say South Asian, right? So all of these things are constructed and created. And I think what our point is at Sacred is to kind of take a step back and recognize the similarities rather than continuing to draw lines and segregate and separate the community. It's very interesting as we have now a moment in time where South Asian Americans are increasingly prominent. I mean, we were talking about Kamala Harris, who was a vice president of the United States of America, who Indian American mother and heritage, and South Asian leader. To have one who was then presidential candidate. Now we're living in an era from Zoran Mamdani to Usha Vance, right?
Yeah.
Who newly elected mayor of New York City, and of course Usha Vance, the second lady of the country, who also has heritage from South Asia. So we're looking at a moment now where at Sacred we believe it's a critically important time to ensure that South Asian Americans are leading with their own narrative, with our own priorities, determining our own future, if you will. And oftentimes the community is splintered and split up along historic lines, whether it's linguistically or on notions of caste or not faith or national origin. And oftentimes we see in the US or in the diaspora, people constructing organizations or entities based off of some of these identity things, whether it's illegal, people working in the legal sector who create, a bar association, or if it's an industry in engineering, et cetera, et cetera. People can splinter and split themselves up and identify in all sorts of groups. All of that's, totally fine, and we respect that. But I think for us at Sacred, we recognized the importance of coming together in a way where we are advocating for our rights, advocating for ensuring that members, elected officials, community leaders understand the diversity of our community, embrace it, and don't accidentally or carelessly misrepresent us. I think that's why we thought Sacred was so important to do, and really to reach out our arms with the breadth of the community and really bring folks together in an effort to build power, to build power in the community, to
Yeah.
make our voice stronger and louder, and to try to make a difference in our renewing our democracy.
It's a beautiful mission. And what I'm seeing is Sacred deconstructing this separation policies that were placed because of colonialism within South Asia, deconstructing them and saying, listen, this is who we are, divided along these lines, but we have figured out that we're actually much more common than we are different. So what we're going to make sure is that now we're going to come back to ourselves. We're going to come back to the commonality that we have as a common thread, and identify that once we recognize those commonalities, we are more powerful as an entity to talk about human rights, to talk about policies that deal with oppression and injustice and equity. And because we have gone through the colonial experience, we know what equity and oppression looks like. right? We know what it looks like so we can be advocates for ourselves and other people. And the desire to separate whatever school of thought you want to follow and believe on the intent of that, though there's an intent to separate us, we're going to counter that because at the end of the day, we can write our own narratives, and we're not going to be the recipients and carry the narratives of other people, right? I mean, I know a very famous slogan during the British rule of India, which is no Indians and no dogs allowed. Okay. For people who don't know that, in some public spaces, the British would implement this type of messaging to be able to place a level of humiliation within South Asia. And that gives you this internal message that you are less than, right? And that's a very colonial tool. Let's just the people that we're oppressing, let's make sure they know their place. And now when we see individuals in different positions of power, it's interesting to see how that did not work out. But also, in addition to that, the conversation I was having with someone else is that whole notion of the British going in to civilize a population. That's how it was sold to the British, to civilize a population. To civilize who? The people that made the Taj Mahal, right? And it's just such a faulty way of thinking and reality that was sold. But now within those tricks that people were experiencing, the tricks that are used to humiliate someone, to make someone feel less and another feel superior, that does trickle down. It's a learned behavior. Supremacy is a learned behavior. Do you feel, in your opinion, watching this and studying this, that the generational trauma that comes from colonialism, that has elements of teaching supremacy and inferiority through humiliation, right? Through otherization, has that seeped into the South Asian community and caused friction within the South Asian community? And is that also another mission of yours through Sacred to counter?
No, absolutely. Such a rich reflection, and thank you for that. I think two thoughts come to my mind in response. The first is an interesting kind of historic analysis looking at South Asia and this supremacist kind of movement. There's a fantastic book many of your listeners in the audience may be familiar with. It's called Caste by New York Times best-selling author Isabel Wilkerson, Pulitzer Prize winner. She wrote this book about 5 years ago. It was very, very popular, and a lot of folks have read it. And she does an excellent job of talking about and explaining the caste system globally, and then giving case studies, and drawing parallels between regions of the world, really focusing on the U.S., Nazi Germany, and South Asia. And one fascinating thing that she draws out in that book is looking at Southern segregationists in the U.S. in the early 1900s. These are people who believed in eugenics, the concept that white people were superior biologically. It's debunked science. Every human has 99.9% the same genetic makeup, and yet the concept of eugenics meant that white people were superior, and it justified essentially empire. But some of these Southern segregationists, one of the leaders of that movement, Madison Grant, explicitly wrote that the concept of Jim Crow South kind of laws and rules was exactly the same objective as the caste system in South Asia. So that concept of looking at these hierarchies, looking at these ways to oppress,
Systems.
systems,
Yeah, they're universal systems.
and learning from each other. In the 1930s, actually, a movement came up in South Asia, in India, that celebrated Hitler, celebrated Nazi Germany, celebrated the Holocaust. And this was a Hindu supremacist or Hindu extremist movement, a belief that the Aryan race was superior. And this is what Hitler described, right? And so in South Asia as well, in the 1930s, it created this movement, a Hindu supremacist movement, that was deeply intertwined with the white supremacist movement. And so I'm talking about, 80 years ago, but it's actually, the reality is that we're watching this happen before our eyes again, that this movement of white supremacist movement in the West and a movement of Hindu supremacists in South Asia, particularly in India, is alive and well and thriving. It's the kind of ideology that's been in power in India. The governing body and the governing leader of India has been part of an organization called the RSS, which was a direct line out of this ideology. And so it's shocking to see all of this happening in present times.
So, and then connecting those dots, like in that book in the cast, is like those ideas of supremacy is part of systems that can elevate that part of your human nature to want to feel superior to somebody else. What that proves actually is that elements exist within all of us, to be honest with you. And sacred specific mission to address this issue when we see it rising again, whether it be in Europe, United States, or in South Asia, it needs to be addressed as an element that did exist and can come up again. And then what gives a tendency to do that? Which brings me to my next question. This question about immigration policies, right, that are guised with ethnocentric lacings. And I think that's very, very important for us to kind of connect the dots on that. Do you see that happening among what you're seeing now across Europe and the West? And is it affecting the South Asian community, right? So we talked about countering the segregation and the supremacy that exists within South Asians that we understand is a taught and learned system, but also it was there before colonialism, so it's also part of human nature. So we recognize it's taught and learned system, and it can also be part of human nature. It can be both. Nature versus nurture is the question, but the elements are there. And so now when we see this happening with immigration policies, how do you think the South Asian community collectively should respond, seeing and gone through colonialism and seeing that, divide and conquer strategy? What should the South Asian community stance in the United States and Europe be when we see immigration policies that are laced with ethnocentric tendencies, which takes us back to the days of no dogs and Indians allowed, because that didn't come out of nowhere.
No, absolutely. And I think what we're seeing right now in a moment, and this is part of the reason why we decided to launch Sacred and create Sacred, is there's been a massive split in the community, which you could roughly attribute to kind of the 1% versus the 99% of us. And the 1% I describe as members of the South Asian American community who have been who've done very well financially, oftentimes linked with the tech boom and the tech industry. And as we've seen kind of wealth inequalities exacerbated in recent decades, we've seen some very wealthy South Asians decide that they want to be part of the 1% in this country. And how do they get rid of their brown skin? Is by embracing kind of a white supremacist movement, frankly, to be honest. We had a candidate for president, Vivek Ramaswamy, who was literally actively pushing limitations on and voter restrictions, right? Saying that, you have to be 25 before you can vote. You have to pass a test before you can vote, get the right to vote. All ballots must be in English. So in a way, really trying to push himself away from the community, English only ballots, not recognizing his own family heritage and language heritage, but then also really trying to be holier than the Pope or more aggressive than other candidates that were running with an anti-immigrant kind of message.
So let me challenge this for a second. Let me
Yeah.
challenge this for a second, because do you think this was because shedding your heritage and shedding where you come from and the systems that have been oppressive, or is it I've evolved? Is the mentality I've evolved and come beyond these things, and I've understood that ideas and what we need to put forward is the most important thing, and we should not be bringing our baggage in to our policies of our past, right? Because this is the argument when we see things like this, that I've moved beyond this. I've moved beyond ethnicity. I've moved beyond the South Asian identity or the race. I've moved beyond this. Is it possible to shed, or is it just an excuse?
I don't think he's moved beyond it because, you can look at trolls attacking him online, kind of white supremacists attacking him, even though he's trying to pander to them. But just to say that it's also critically important to look at this not within a kind of an insulated, just looking at our community. We must look at other immigrant communities to this country, Irish Americans, like the heritage of Steve Bannon, or German Americans, heritage of Donald Trump, right? There are many communities who've come to this country who have not been welcomed and treated well. They've been stepped on, or spit on, or called terrible things, right? And they oftentimes have to be more aggressive, or more anti-immigrant as a result, right? To try to make up
Prove
for.
themselves. Yeah. Prove
Yeah, and
themselves.
so I view very much this in the same line. Vivek Ramaswamy
Okay.
and others like him in a very similar kind of trend that we've seen in the U.S.
Okay. What is Sacred's message to a way forward to address issues of systemic racism or elements of supremacy within the South Asian community? What is Sacred's mission for a way forward?
No, it's a great question, and the reality is the South Asian American community is being done badly, a massive disservice by people who claim to be members of the community, who, like I described earlier, oftentimes happen to be very wealthy or very powerful, and they're the ones who represent themselves to the country as leaders of the community. And I think that's not the truth. They're often peddling anti-immigrant sentiment. They're often peddling Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism, or anti minority rights. They're very aggressive in pushing, frankly, a white supremacist ideology and a Christian nationalist agenda, and it's shocking. So for us at Sacred, we believe the vast majority of South Asians actually believe in our democracy, believe in minority faith communities' rights, believe in embracing immigrants' rights, and the heritage of this country. And so for us, we believe we have not yet mobilized at the level that we need to, and especially at a moment when there are so many South Asian Americans pushing anti-democratic agendas. We really want to come together in Chicago, in Illinois, and across the country to really push forward a message for renewing our democracy.
And people around the country can get involved, even if you're not in Chicago.
Yeah, absolutely. We are focused on Chicago as we grow, but we are very interested in connecting with like-minded leaders and other organizations across the South Asian American community in different parts of the country. You can find out more about us at sacreddemocracy.org.
Thank you, Pushkar. Thank you so much. Thank you for your vision. Thank you for your commitment. And thank you for not passing the buck on something that seems extremely, extremely disheartening and complex issues to solve. We're going to have another conversation with you later because we didn't get into your time at the UN and your work at Gaza City and how we can reconnect with our humanity across the border. So I appreciate your commitment to that as well and giving us your time. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. My honor. Thank you.